All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest installment of the Connect and Reflect series for the NODCC. So every month we are bringing in different experts to talk about different topics that are relevant to your DCC family members or you as a DCC individual. And so we are so thankful tonight to have Jasmin Turner with us. And we'll be talking about a mindful approach to managing big emotions and energy over the holidays for DCC families and individuals, which, it's probably generally applicable to all the kids and the adults. But I think, it's a very timely topic. And so we really look forward to hearing what we should be thinking about from a DCC perspective in particular. So per usual, I will give you all a very brief introduction of Jasmin, and then she's going to give a presentation for us, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. We encourage you throughout, feel free to put things in the chat, give us your feedback, just do the things that she's saying resonate with you. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. It makes it so much easier for me to find those questions. But if you put it in the chat, don't worry, I'm looking there too. I'm everywhere in the background. So without further ado, I will introduce Jasmin. So Jasmin is a PhD student in the clinical psychology program at the University of Iowa. She works in the social cognitive neuroscience lab where her research focuses on functional connectivity. Ultimately, she hopes to better understand the development of social emotional processes and mental health outcomes in individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders, and is committed to enhancing the mental well-being of those within the neurodivergent community. Prior to her PhD, Jasmin earned her MA in clinical psychology at California State University, Northridge. She continued her academic journey as a researcher coordinator at Caltech, where she worked alongside Dr. Lynn K. Paul, who we've also had here talking to everyone tonight during the Connect and Reflect series, where she studied behavioral development in infants and children with Agenesis of the Corpus Callosum. This experience fueled Jasmin's passion for working with individuals affected by disorders of the corpus callosum, and she has been a great participant and advocate ever since. So Jasmin, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. All right.
Awesome. Well, I will drop off the screen and you go right ahead. Thank you so much.
All right, let me get this started. Okay, can I just check? You're just seeing my slides, is that right?
Yes, yeah. You're good to go.
Okay, great. Just wanted to check. Okay. So first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to the NODCC, to Barb, to Deanna, just for asking me to do this. I'm particularly excited about this topic. Partly just because emotion regulation is a big interest of mine, particularly as it relates to mental health within neurodevelopmental disorders. But the other reason is that kind of over the years, through the research that I've done with Lynn Paul and just talking to families about their experience raising a child with a disorder of the corpus callosum, and also just my experience working with the adults, it seems that emotional regulation is definitely a challenge. And so I think it's an area that really deserves some attention. And I'm really hoping that, there's a lot I would love to cover tonight. Obviously, I'm limited, but I'm really hoping that you at least leave here with some knowledge and some tools to help you feel a little bit more empowered, both as individuals with a disorder of the corpus callosum. I know we have some of our adults here, but also those of you that are parents and caregivers. Hopefully you feel more prepared to manage these big emotions over the holidays. I want to emphasize my goal here is not to prevent big emotions. The reality is they are going to happen. And again, like Deanna said, a lot of what I talk about tonight is relevant to all of us. I think, the holidays are challenging at times. They can be stressful. And so it is completely understandable that big emotions are going to come up. So the goal is not to prevent those, but really, again, just to give you those tools to understand what's happening and respond in helpful ways. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we'll talk about tonight. I'm just going to briefly give an overview of what we mean by emotion dysregulation. We'll talk a little bit about how this is then showing up in the brain, just briefly what is happening when we're experiencing emotions and engaging in emotional behavior. We'll then focus more on how emotion regulation is impaired in disorders of the corpus callosum, and then we'll tie this into why this might be challenging over the holidays and some ways that you can manage these emotions as they come up. So to begin, when we talk about emotion regulation, this is the ability to effectively manage and respond to an emotional experience. So on the one hand, this is the ability to recognize what we're feeling, that awareness of an emotional experience. It involves our understanding of why we're feeling what we're feeling. It involves the ability to inhibit maladaptive responses, that ability to kind of engage in more goal-directed behaviors that are going to help reduce that emotional experience. And ultimately, to do that, we need access to strategies. So being able to acknowledge what you're feeling and choose a strategy that is going to help regulate that response. On the other hand, we have emotion dysregulation. So this is the inability to regularly use healthy strategies to moderate negative emotions. I want to emphasize the word regularly here. This is not an all or nothing thing. It's not that you're one or the other. The reality is all of us at times are emotionally dysregulated. There are times when it is much more challenging to regulate our emotions, particularly if we're just more stressed. That ability to effectively manage emotions can become harder. So this applies to all of us, but one of the things that we do see, and this is true for most neurodevelopmental disorders, so not just agenesis of the corpus callosum, but also we see this with autism, with ADHD, there are higher rates of emotion dysregulation. There are more challenges with regulating emotions as they come up. So in a moment, we'll talk about why that seems to be and what some of the challenges are that are specific to disorders of the corpus callosum. But first, a little bit of neurobiology. I'm going to keep this very simple, okay? There's a lot that is about to be missing from this, but I just want to give a kind of an overview of what's happening in the brain. And the main thing that I want you to be or to take from this slide and to kind of hold in your mind as we go through the rest of this presentation is that the regions of the brain that are involved in experiencing an emotion and the regions of the brain that are involved in being able to reason about it and regulate that emotion are in different areas. Okay, so the ability for these areas to communicate depends on connections within the brain. So when it comes to experiencing emotions, this is largely a result of regions in the brain collectively that we call the limbic system. When it comes to reasoning, or more broadly, just executive functioning, so planning, decision-making, problem-solving, that is the role of the frontal lobe, so that's at the front of the brain. One way that you can think of the limbic system is, well, in fact, a specific part of the limbic system that we call the amygdala. We can think of this as an alarm system. So the job of the amygdala is essentially to pay attention to the environment and look out for any potential threats, anything that makes us less safe. And when it detects something, whether we're really unsafe or not, if it decides there's something there that's a threat, that alarm system becomes activated. Okay, this is creating this emotional experience. Now, sometimes it reacts to things that it doesn't need to. And ideally, what is happening is the frontal lobe is stepping in and that reasoning is happening, that part of us that's kind of making sense and interpreting that emotion and saying, you know, we don't need to freak out. This is fine. You know, it's pulling in all of that prior experience. It's thinking about the context. It's making sense of what's happening. Let's say you're feeling overly anxious about something that's coming up. It's that part of you saying, you know, we've done this before, and we're going to plan, and we're going to, you know, we're going to be fine. Okay. So it's there to kind of step in and help make sense of emotions and help regulate those emotions as they come up. So if emotions or if the limbic system is kind of our alarm system, I then like to think of the frontal lobe kind of like the internet. That's where we have access to all of those resources, all of the information that we need to make sense of it and to respond appropriately. Now, in some cases, in an ideal world, these two areas are communicating effectively. And when a big emotion comes up, frontal lobe can step in, that reasoning occurs, and we can manage that response. However, there are times, regardless of whether or not you have a corpus callosum, this applies to all of us, there are times where emotions can become particularly intense and we lose access to those reasoning skills. So again, if we stick with this idea of the internet and our alarm system, I want you to imagine that they are connected via Wi-Fi, okay? So in order for them to communicate, that connection needs to be there. When emotions become too big, it's almost like we could think of this like a storm, and that Wi-Fi connection goes out. Okay, so now you've got this big emotion, and all of the information and resources you need to make sense of that emotion and to regulate that emotion are now offline. You can't access them. If you have ever tried to reason with a child or anyone for that matter, when they are in an extremely emotional state, you will know you don't get very far, right? They don't have access to those skills in that moment. So there is no point even trying to reason while those emotions are intense. The first goal really needs to be, let's regulate those emotions, let's reduce the intensity so that those reasoning skills can come back online. Then if we need to talk about what happened, then we can address that. But in that moment, while that Wi-Fi connection is lost, the goal is just to get that back online. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about ways to do that later on in the presentation. I'm now going to move on to things that are specific to disorders of the corpus callosum. But I just want you to hold this in mind as we go through this, that really for effective emotion regulation, we need these two regions to be communicating. And that can be challenging when we have all of those connections. But now imagine not having as many connections, which is what we're seeing with a disorder of the corpus callosum, right? We're seeing reduced connectivity in the brain. So this is even more challenging. But it can become even more challenging because of a few particular areas. Again, I can't cover everything in the time that I have. So I've got a few slides on this, kind of covering the main areas that cause these challenges. And the first one is emotional awareness and experience. So one of the first things that we need to be able to do in order to manage our emotions is just recognize that they are happening, right? We need to know there is an emotion there in order to be able to even think about how we're going to manage it. And one of the things that we see with disorders of the corpus callosum and other neurodevelopmental disorders is sometimes there are just difficulties recognizing an emotion or recognizing that the emotion is there before it becomes too big. The other piece of this is, in order to actually identify what you're feeling, you also need to recognize it. You need to know it's there, and then you need to make an interpretation as to what that emotion is. So for example, if I am aware that what I'm feeling is loneliness, I can then make the decision that, okay, I clearly need connection. I'm going to reach out to a friend or someone that is a safe person for me to talk to. I can choose a strategy based on what I'm feeling. So in the case of not being able to recognize emotions, it is then difficult to choose a strategy that is going to help regulate that. It also means that it's much harder to communicate what that feeling is. Maybe I know that I'm feeling something, but if I can't label that, if I can't accurately interpret what I'm feeling, then I can't communicate to someone else what that is, which is also going to make it harder to regulate. The other thing that I kind of briefly mentioned is sometimes even when they are able to recognize the emotion, it may not be until that emotion is more intense. So again, we're going to see that, and this is going to come up a lot as a theme throughout this evening. There seems to be this tendency to experience emotions much more intensely. If you can't quickly capture what you're feeling and respond, then it's likely going to escalate. And if it escalates too much, this is where we might lose that Wi-Fi connection. Okay, so we're more likely to see that internet connection kind of disappear. And so now it's more difficult to regulate the emotion, even now that they may know what they're feeling. The ability to actually access those resources and to respond appropriately is going to be a lot harder. Okay. So another reason that we see difficulties is related to just the way that a DCC brain is using energy. An analogy that I think many of you have probably heard multiple times now is this idea of taking the freeway. So if you have a corpus callosum, in order for your brain to transfer information between the two hemispheres or between the two sides of the brain, it is able to essentially take the freeway. It can go the fastest way possible. But if you don't have a corpus callosum, then your brain needs to take the back roads. It can still get where it's going, but it is going to take a lot longer to do that because it doesn't have that freeway. And in the process of doing this, it is using up a huge amount of energy. And what we see here is what we call reduced processing speed. So their brains are just taking a lot longer to do things. They might be able to do it, but it's having to work so much harder to do these things. A situation, I mean, just linking this to the holidays, I think an area that's worth focusing on is just socializing and how this can come up. One of the things that we hear quite a lot from parents with younger kids is early on, it's, everything's fine, they're doing well in school, they're making friends, and then they enter those teenage years, and this becomes much more challenging. And that's largely the result of just how complex social situations become. And this is something I think, we see over the holidays. There are larger gatherings, just more social interactions with people that maybe they don't see very often. And when you're in a more complex social situation, more people, more social cues to try to pay attention to, more facial expressions to try to understand, the brain, again, is having to work so much harder. And given that there's this reduced processing speed, this then is, again, creating a huge demand on the brain's energy resources. And so when you combine all of this, you start to see cognitive fatigue. The brain is exhausted. It is doing everything that it can just to keep up with everything going on around it and all of the kind of complexities of the social situation. And when that cognitive fatigue occurs, again, that Wi-Fi connection is likely to be lost. Big emotions come up, and that ability to make a decision on what to do, that ability to prioritize and plan and problem solve, all of that becomes harder. And so again, you've got a situation where that emotion is really hard to regulate. So what research shows us is that people with a disorder of the corpus callosum have difficulties with cognitive flexibility. So some of the limitations you might see is having a hard time thinking about things from someone else's perspective. The ability to kind of zoom out and see the big picture. You might see that tendency to get fixated on certain things or get stuck on certain topics or certain ideas. But the other way that we see this show up is difficulties with change or a hard time shifting gears, particularly when something is new or unexpected. And so for that reason, there is this high need for routine and predictability, which again comes back to just how hard their brain is working. If there is routine, if they are able to predict what's going to happen, then their brain doesn't have to work as hard. It knows what's coming next. Versus when something suddenly happens that's unexpected or, that's not part of their usual routine, the brain is going to take a while to adapt to that change, to shift gears, essentially. And as that is happening, that can lead to increased frustration, higher stress levels, because they're just working so hard. Their brain is working so hard to deal with this change. As a result of that, not only have you got that increased frustration and that higher stress level, having that then makes it harder to deal with any more emotions that come up. So the more stressed we are, the more frustrated, the more challenging emotion regulation becomes, and the likelihood of those emotions is going to be higher because you're already in that negative state. The last kind of piece of this that I want to mention related to why these difficulties can occur is specific to sensory challenges and particularly sensory overload. So this is when our brains essentially are overwhelmed by too much sensory input, and that might be sights. For example, if we put this into the context of the holidays, maybe you or your child have a hard time with flashing Christmas lights. It could be sounds, whether that's too many sounds or the volume's too loud. It could be certain smells, certain tastes, certain textures, touch. But essentially, the incoming sensory information becomes so intense that it is overwhelming. And as a result of that, the nervous system becomes dysregulated, and we see that this stress response takes over. So what I mean by that is there's a fight, flight, freeze response. We'll talk about this more on the next slide in terms of what this actually looks like. But the idea here is the brain is going into that stress response. And again, you're going to hear me keep saying this, that Wi-Fi connection can be lost. And so because they're in that state, it becomes harder to regulate those emotions. In addition, this just comes along with its own emotions. If you are feeling overwhelmed by all of this incoming sensory information, then you might be more frustrated, you might feel anxious, you might feel angry. So it creates its own negative emotions, but then any more emotions that come up during that state are just going to be much more intense. You'll also see, again, not just because the Wi-Fi connection is lost, but just as a result of the brain trying to process so much, executive functioning declines. So decision-making is harder, planning is harder. People might feel kind of a sense of fogginess, where it's just, they're just trying to process all of that incoming sensory information, that everything else kind of goes out of the window. So I want to spend a moment on this in particular, because I think the holidays are a very stimulating time for everyone. And this is, one of the, I think, main challenges for, individuals with a disorder of the corpus callosum during this time. So I want to focus on how this shows up, both for the adults that we have here with this, to help you guys identify some of these early warning signs that this is happening, and then for those of you that are parents and caregivers, to help you notice some of these warning signs so that you can maybe step in and help de-escalate this before things kind of get out of control. So I think one of the easiest behavioral signs to actually see and to observe is this increase in irritability. So you might start to notice that you or your child is becoming more easily wound up, quicker to react. And I want to introduce a term here that I really like, and it's a window of tolerance. And so the idea is we have this optimal level of arousal that allows us to deal with the ups and downs of emotions that come with everyday life. So when maybe stress levels are low, things are going well, or our nervous system is regulated, that window of tolerance is going to be wider. And it's easier to manage big emotions as they come up. If we are more dysregulated, if we're more stressed, and again, this applies to everyone, then that window of tolerance becomes smaller. And so it is much easier for us to become irritable. It is much easier for us to react really quickly because our tolerance has gone down. And actually, I want to take a moment here, as much as we're focusing on individuals with a DCC, like I said, holidays are a stressful time for everyone. And I want to remind the parents and caregivers that your emotions matter too. And just to be aware of your own window of tolerance throughout this time. Sometimes you're going to react quickly. Sometimes you might not always respond in a way that you wished you had. That is understandable. And if we're just, within the concept of mindfulness, just being aware of that within yourself throughout the holidays, noticing like, oh, I'm a little more irritable right now. Maybe I need to recharge or do something to help me de-stress a little bit, just to increase that window of tolerance. So another sign you might notice when someone is starting to enter this period of sensory overload is more restlessness and discomfort. Again, the brain is just processing so much, and so this can be uncomfortable and can create this restlessness. I also mentioned that in this dysregulated state, the stress response takes over. So someone is going into this fight, flight, or freeze response. This is essentially a sense of panic. Oh my goodness, there is so much information. I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. And you will see people respond to this in different ways. If you're someone that's maybe more of a flight person at times, then you might see this show up as a desire to escape. You just want to get out of that situation. It might be more of kind of jumping down to fatigue here, but in people that tend to freeze more, essentially, the nervous system is, instead of going into a hyper arousal state, as you might see with fight or flight, you're seeing this hypo arousal state where there's just this freeze response. And this is where the person experiencing this might have this overwhelming sense of fatigue. Things start to be foggy, and essentially, even though on the outside it might look like emotion regulation, they might seem quite calm. Internally, this is a very stressed state where they're shutting down. Other behaviors you might notice, again, for kind of parents and caregivers to pay attention to, you might see this need to block incoming sensory information. That might be a sign that there is sensory overload occurring. That might be, covering their eyes or putting a blanket over them to kind of block out visual information. That might be covering their ears, or with, older children, if they've got access to like noise canceling headphones, things like that, that can help reduce incoming information. Those are some of the things you might want to look out for as signs of this happening. Okay, so preparing for the holidays. I imagine that as I've been talking already, there are probably things that you're thinking, yeah, based on this, I can see why holidays are challenging. A lot of overstimulation, socializing, new things, new situations. So I'm going to focus on a couple of key areas here. And at this point, the goal is really proactive emotion regulation. So things that you can do, again, we're not trying to prevent big emotions. We're just trying to reduce the likelihood that they'll occur and kind of the frequency of them. So one, there is the lack of routine, structure, and predictability, whether that is just, school is finished for the holidays, or for our adults, it might be that your work schedule has changed. Extracurricular activities may have stopped for a while. So there's that aspect of routine that changes. That then creates more unstructured time. Okay. And when we have a lot of unstructured time, that requires, unless someone is saying, hey, you're going to do this, we have to make a decision about how we're going to use that time. We might need to prioritize. We might need to plan. These skills are challenging if you are missing your corpus callosum. So having that unstructured time might be a little anxiety inducing. It requires a little bit more executive functioning to decide how to use that time. So I realize there are limitations to this in itself, but ideally, one of the goals here would be limit changes where possible. For example, I know for some families, once it's holiday time and there isn't school in the morning, bedtime can go out the window. And it's like, we can be more flexible here. Who cares if you're going to bed a little bit later? You don't have to be up early. That might be fine for some kids, but for some, that's an area where you can maintain a little bit of routine and structure that could be really beneficial for them. Not to mention, if they're sleep deprived, emotion regulation becomes even harder. So finding areas, my point here is just finding areas where you can create some routine or stick to some routine. If there are certain activities they do throughout the week, trying to find ways to stick to those activities or incorporate them so that they have that sense of structure. Especially, I think, over the Christmas holidays, if they have time off from school, create a new structure. That if there's going to be days where they're at home all day, having activities planned out and letting them know, at this time we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, so that there is, again, that sense of structure for them. Again, I know this is not always possible, or there are limits to this. So areas where that can't be addressed, prepare for the change. Talk to them about where these changes are going to occur and what this is going to look like. If you have plans for Thanksgiving Day or just other days throughout the holiday, letting them know, like, this is what we're going to do. This is what this is going to look like. It might seem silly to go through every single step and tell them, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, but you are preparing their brain. You are doing that work up front so that once they're in the moment, that is now not, oh my goodness, I had no idea this was going to happen and this is brand new and now I need time to process this. You are giving that information ahead of time. Another way to think about this so the reason I've got practice on here is think about things that might be new for them, especially if you're not staying at home. If you are going to someone else's, it might be worth giving them a call and saying, hey, I'm just wondering what's on the menu. What do you have planned for the day? So that you can kind of think ahead about where there might be challenges. If you know that there is going to be certain foods that are new, try introducing those foods ahead of time so that it's not brand new. And if it turns out that whatever is on the menu, if you know that's going to be a huge challenge, maybe it means taking something extra, just to help avoid some of those big emotions in relation to that. Maybe if there are certain games that you like to play as a family, that's an opportunity to practice, so that again, you're not throwing them into a social situation where there are all of a sudden these rules to follow, and all of this sensory information at the same time. Like, playing games, that can be challenging when there are certain rules and expectations. So that is an opportunity to practice. In regards to energy and sensory stimulation, again, just from a proactive perspective, schedule time to recharge. And what I mean by that is plan ahead. If you know, okay, we've got this event, this event, this event, factor in some time in between that, not just for those of you with a disorder of the corpus callosum, not just for your children, but for all of you, just to have time to decompress before the next thing. And so that might mean, going on a walk. It might mean just having some lazy time, maybe just watching some TV. Maybe especially if you know that you yourself or your child needs alone time, schedule that in. Make sure they have that alone time to recharge. So again, you can try to keep that window of tolerance as open as possible. More specifically to sensory stimulation, identify what those sensory needs and triggers are. Again, if you know lights are an issue, maybe you don't want flashing Christmas lights. Or if you know, for example, that loud sounds or too many sounds are going to be an issue, and you're going somewhere where you don't have control over that, then maybe it's, Christmas is coming up. Maybe this is a good time to invest, if you haven't already, in some noise canceling headphones. Something to help reduce that. So we could spend a long time just talking about all the different things you can do for sensory needs, but there's just a couple of ideas. And then the last piece of this would be creating a management plan ahead of time, predicting where these challenges might come up, and deciding, okay, this is what we're going to do. And on the next slide, we are going to talk a little more about specific coping strategies when emotions come up, but just predicting ahead of time, where might these challenges be? Something I want to acknowledge is, I imagine for a lot of the parents and caregivers that are on here tonight, if you're hosting, you might be trying to cook a meal for who knows how many people. You might have multiple kids running around that you're trying to manage. There's probably going to be a lot going on, and you're not always going to have the capacity to just pause and focus on this one child. So have a plan for the whole family. If one child is having a meltdown, who else can step in, and what is the plan in that moment? What is it that's best going to comfort them and help soothe them in that moment? Which brings me to my last slide. What do we do when those big emotions come up? Again, this is an area where I could talk for hours. There are lots of techniques. I'm just going to focus on a few. And then I figured, as we get into Q&A, if you have more specific questions specific to you or your child, we can talk about that then. Like I said earlier, that if that Wi-Fi connection is lost, you don't want to be trying to reason. You don't really want to try to talk them out of this emotion. The goal is just let that emotion be seen and try to soothe it. I always feel like a hypocrite when I bring this one up, because I know it's useful and I never do it myself, but breathing techniques can be incredibly useful, especially when there's that kind of hyper arousal, just calming the nervous system down. Breathing is a great one for this. For the adults on here, I recommend, go online. There are a bunch of different breathing techniques. Test them all out, see what works for you. For example, I don't use this as much as I should, but I know that for me, one where I breathe in for 7, hold for 7, and out for 4 is most calming for me. For kids, and this is one you might want to teach ahead of time, because again, if you're trying to teach them a breathing technique in a moment when they're feeling emotional, might not make much progress. But using their hand, so maybe it's like they trace up their fingers, and as they go up, they breathe in, and as they come down, they breathe out, and they just trace up and down their hands and follow that pattern of breathing up and down is just one idea. It might mean, again, going back to that need to escape when there's sensory overload, maybe you take a walk. And maybe this is something where, again, for the adults, I know I've shared this with a few of you already, letting people know ahead of time so that you don't seem rude when you're just leaving the situation, but just let people know, like, if I become overwhelmed, I might go on a short walk. Personally, I love taking my dog to social events because I will use him to help regulate emotions as they come up. And if I'm feeling overwhelmed and I need to escape, I have an excuse. I need to take him on a walk. So if you can, if you've got a pet, you've got a dog you can take, that might be a good way to do that. But I think just finding a way to politely remove yourself or to remove your child from the situation in a way that they can get some space and kind of calm down. Creating a safe space ahead of time. Again, if you're at home, that might be easier. Having them go to their bedroom or wherever it is that feels safe for them, just to have some alone time to decompress. If you are somewhere else, you might need to plan that a little bit differently. So if possible, if it's not going to be too long, you might want to go into the bathroom. Something that, again, I spoke to the adults about was using your phone as a way to withdraw slightly. And again, this might be something you want to acknowledge ahead of time so that it doesn't seem rude, but just letting your friends and family know, if I'm overwhelmed, I might go on my phone for a little bit just to disconnect and give myself time to calm down. And then just more specific to kind of managing overload and just difficult sensory situations, creating some kind of sensory or comfort kit. Ideally something that maybe you can take with you if you're going somewhere else. So this might be music if you find music calming, or if your child finds music calming, that can be really helpful for regulating emotions. I've already mentioned noise cancelling headphones. What's great about that, I have the AirPods, and what I love is there's that setting where it's like I can just turn down incoming information. I still hear people, but I can block a lot of it out. Weighted blankets. I love my weighted blanket. Again, just to create kind of that soothing sensation. Stimming toys, essential oils. Oh, an overload card. So this is really I mean, anyone could use this, but particularly if you have a child that is nonverbal, having a card that basically they can give you when they are in that state. And again, this does require them to be aware, but anytime they're feeling something or just need to get out of this situation, they have a card that they can give to you that tells you, okay, they need help removing themselves from the situation right now. If you're going somewhere else, maybe taking a favorite blanket or a favorite toy. Maybe for adults, maybe it's like an item that brings you joy. So in those moments when you're feeling overwhelmed, you have something that you can look at that brings you a little bit of joy. That is everything for my slides. I do just want to emphasize one more time that big emotions over the holidays are understandable for everyone. So parents, caregivers, please prioritize your own mental health as well and your own emotions. And all of these things are equally important for you. Take that time to have alone time, to relax, to recharge. You are then going to be in a much better position to help manage emotions as they come up. It's a lot easier to be mindful and aware of what's happening if you yourself are in a regulated state. So please prioritize yourself as well. And with that, thank you. I would love to take questions.
Awesome. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I feel 10 times more prepared for the holidays than I was prior to this chat. So thank you for going through that great presentation. I will just let the attendees know you can just use the Q&A feature to type in. Sorry, this is my 2-year-old. She wants to join the call. Say hi.
Hi.
Okay. Hatu's gonna go downstairs. Okay. So you can use the Q&A to ask the questions that you have, but so I can put myself on mute. I will ask one question really quick. We were talking in the chat about how our DCCers seem to get over their big emotions really quickly. So there'll be a big emotion, and then if you distract them or change the subject, it's like it never even happened, even if the emotions were quite intense. Can you talk a little bit about neurologically why that might be?
Yeah, actually, this reminds me, I didn't really get into it on that last slide, but I had distract up there because that can be very useful. And first, just for the adults, and actually this applies to the kids too, but let's say either you or your child has a specific interest, take advantage of that. Maybe have a podcast prepared on that topic or a YouTube video that, you can pull up in that moment to distract them. In terms of what's happening again, this is an area where we need to do a lot more research. And I will say, myself, Lynn, our team are working on this. We are enrolling more teenagers, and we're expanding some of the questionnaires that we use to try to understand what is happening more with emotion regulation. And it's something I really want to look at. But I think essentially one of the things that can keep us trapped in an emotion is that tendency to ruminate or overthink what we're feeling. And in order to do that, there really needs to be that kind of reasoning part of us that's trying to figure out why we feel what we feel, trying to make sense of that. And if we're ruminating, if we're stuck on that, then we tend to stay in an emotion longer unless we can effectively regulate it. If you're not doing that, if you're just having that emotional experience and you're not thinking about it, then it makes sense that it's a lot easier to be distracted and to get out of that. There's actually, I'm getting a little too much into research here, but there's been a couple of studies, for example, looking at emotions in people with Alzheimer's or amnesia. And so they'll like present them emotional videos, they induce an emotion. 30 minutes later, they will still, in a lot of cases, experience that emotion. And actually what I'm pointing to here is kind of the other side of this. It seems like even though they don't have a memory of what caused that, the fact that they can't introduce those regulatory strategies and they can't kind of think about why they're feeling what they're feeling can then cause that to go on longer. So there's two sides to this. There's the benefit of being able to think about it so that you can regulate it. But if you're thinking about it and not regulating it, then that can then prolong that emotion. So I think, I mean, it's great to hear that these are kind of short emotions and emphasizes the importance of having these distraction techniques in that moment as a way to kind of help change gears.
Yeah, and we're so fortunate we've got some adults with DCC in the group who have been sharing their experiences growing up, and a lot of that resonates with them as well. Kathy just commented on that, and Sarah's been sharing some great comments throughout the call. So another question, you talked a bit about cognitive flexibility and how for folks with DCC, it might be harder to have that cognitive flexibility. Can you talk to us a little bit about maybe some mindfulness daily routines, or just things that we can do on a day-to-day basis leading up to the holidays to cultivate that mindfulness or ability to manage big emotions?
I think, and this is for a moment just going to specifically target kind of parents and caregivers, I think just paying attention to particular changes in routine that do trigger big emotions. So just creating an awareness throughout the day. What is important for my child? What aspects of routine need to stay versus I noticed when this changes, this is fine, they can handle this. So just being, when I think of mindfulness, it's really like being present, being aware in the moment of what's happening. So day by day, just monitoring what is triggering these emotions, just so that you know what aspects of routine are important. I think that is also true for our adults with a disorder of the corpus callosum. This might be a little challenging at times, but again, just trying to bring yourself into the moment and pay attention within yourself. What is important to me in my routine? If something changes, for example, do I find it harder when I go to bed later? Or is it harder for me to regulate emotions when I don't have my morning routine? For example, I know that having at least 20 minutes in bed just to like drink my cup of coffee before I start the day, that's important for me to then be regulated throughout the day. So just paying attention to those components. And again, for our adults, something that I like to, in terms of emotions and mindfulness, kind of an analogy that my therapist once shared that I like is, you're kind of sitting on a train track and the train is going by, and these are kind of our thoughts and emotions. And the idea isn't to prevent those, it's just to sit and observe them. So you're just being mindful of those thoughts, of those emotions. So again, for our adults, being mindful of what is going on in your head as these big emotions come up. Are there certain thinking patterns that seem to trigger these emotions? Particularly, I think for the holidays, thinking about social situations. There might be that tendency to have some social anxiety or to worry about whether or not you're doing the right thing or picking up on certain social cues. So just being mindful of those thoughts as they come up, and trying to, push them out as much as possible so that you can actually enjoy the moment.
Yeah. And I'll just remind everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A or put them in the chat. I'll find them. I've got questions for days, but would love to hear from some of you about what is important. So another question that I have, you talked a little bit about sensory overload, and that also being an area of challenges. And my question is that adaptable? For example, if you've got a young one, or even for adults as well that are having sensory challenges, is it helpful to expose them to those sensory challenges to, make it a little less difficult? Or should you just respect those boundaries and say, no, they don't like loud noises, I'm going to keep them away from that?
A mixture of both, I think. One thing I will say is the holidays may not be the time to fully test some of these things.
To experiment.
Right. Especially if you want to reduce the likelihood of big emotions. But the reality is, like, we want them to grow up into healthy, happy, functioning adults, and that means being able to manage certain situations. Some of the areas where I think it's definitely possible would be if there are challenges with certain tastes. That is definitely something that you could work on, trying new foods. I think, again, linking it back to just processing new information, it can be particularly challenging when something's new. So if there are certain smells or tastes or textures, these are things I think, yes, you can try exposing them. Ultimately, in some cases, that might not be effective. And I think being able to acknowledge when, and this is where, therapists can help with this, but being able to acknowledge, okay, we've tried this is really overwhelming for them, and we need to respect this boundary. I think what can be helpful is, like I said, we want them to be able to become functioning adults, acknowledging what those challenges are and helping them accept, like, you're going to have to go into social situations sometimes that are going to be overly stimulating. There are going to be loud sounds sometimes that we cannot control. There are going to be bright lights at times that we can't control. So having coping mechanisms in place, you can get tinted sunglasses, or not just sunglasses, you can get tinted glasses, having noise cancelling headphones, just having things in place like fidget toys or kind of stimming toys, so that, again, you're just helping them cope in those situations. Whether or not, I honestly don't know whether or not they'll adapt to that over time. Maybe our adults can chime in here and let us know if you've tried any of these things and whether you have noticed an improvement. But I think really that, just helping them learn, like, you are going to be in we can't protect you from all of these things. There are going to be things that are overstimulating, and here's what you can do to help regulate this and to help reduce this stimulation.
That is very helpful. And I think the other side of that is, okay, so there are all these things that we are doing, either as people with DCC or as parents of people with DCC to get ready for the holidays. What about for our family members, our friends, and our loved ones? I think, for adults, you touched a little bit on, letting people know in advance what it is that you're going to need so that you don't seem like you're rude or awkward as you're going through it. But what about for adults that are trying to explain what's happening with their child, or how should they talk to family and friends about it?
I think whenever possible, especially if you're going to someone else's house or you've got people coming over, I think it's great to have that conversation, not just for your child, but for yourself, so that if, let's say, a big meltdown happens, you're not worried about what everyone else is thinking, and like, you've already prepared them that this might happen, and that can kind of take away some of that whatever you're feeling within yourself as that happens. I think using some of the kind of analogies that I've used tonight to help explain why this is happening, if you feel that that's important. or it could just be explaining some of the things that might be triggering to them, or what it is that they'll need, or just the fact, like in the same way as I've advised the adults, letting them know, hey, there might be a time where we're gonna take him or her, out for a walk, or we're gonna put them in their room for a bit just so that they can recharge. Or, if you see them on their phone for a while, it might be their way of coping. Just letting them know what some of those behaviors might be, or some of the things you've planned. Maybe it's letting them know, like, if there's a lot going on, and they're getting overstimulated, they might become more hyper, they might become more emotional, they might become more angry, and just preparing them for that so that it isn't, such of a surprise in that moment. Again, I mentioned, like, for those of you that are hosting, you're doing so much and you might not be able to drop everything. So maybe it's, even if you've got, friends or family there that are safe people for your child, incorporating them to help support them in those moments, especially if you're on the lookout for signs that, a big meltdown is happening. If you're busy doing something else, it might require someone else just to be keeping an eye on them. Or especially, I think another area would be if you've got friends and family bringing other kids. And again, maybe there are certain triggers that are going to be hard. Talking to them ahead of time about that. If they have kids that are capable of kind of understanding the situation, letting them know as well. I really think it's a personal decision on how much you want to communicate with them. But ultimately, if people are receptive to hearing some of the ways this can be challenging, then I think it can be really beneficial, both for you as a caregiver, and just for creating a safe space for your child.
Yeah. And one parent asked, she's got a 5-year-old that has a lot of meltdowns when, activities are changing, when they're out in public, and it's very hard for her to get ready in the mornings, and she kind of resists everything, even trying to wake up and get her out the door. And she'll dump her toys or throw things. And the question she asked is, how do you combat parent fatigue from dealing with the resistance or meltdowns? And that's real. So what about the parents when they're dealing with all of these behaviors?
A couple of things. One, again, I want to emphasize, like, prioritize taking care of yourself and think about that window of tolerance, making sure there is time where you get to recharge, just space for yourself, whatever it is that's relaxing for you, whatever you consider kind of recharging, whatever you consider self-care. That is so important, because if you're exhausted, then your ability to respond is going to be limited. You're more likely to have those quick reactions, which ultimately is going to escalate their emotions. If they're feeling like they're not seen and you're upset with them and you're frustrated, they're going to feel worse. At the same time, forgive yourself. You're going to react sometimes. And I think just having that self-compassion, or trying to develop that self-compassion and acknowledge that you're not going to be perfect, that's okay. Sometimes it's going to be really, really hard. And I think the key part there is repair. Maybe you have a reaction and you think afterwards, oh, I got angry, or I got frustrated. There is the opportunity to repair and to show them again that ability to regulate your own emotion and sit down and say, I was feeling this in this moment, and that led to this behavior, and I'm sorry that I reacted this way. And that's an opportunity to kind of strengthen that connection and model some of those regulation techniques. I feel like this is, again, another topic I could talk for a long time about, but I think ultimately just prioritizing your own self-care and just having that compassion at times when you are going to be exhausted.
Yeah. It's par for the course for the holidays in general, right? Well, thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of our questions, for your wonderful presentation. I know I took a lot of notes, and will definitely be trying to implement them. Just a few key points for everyone attending. This will be our last Connect and Reflect series for the year, so everybody can actually get through the holidays. But Jasmin will be back with us in January for another chat, and also we're going to have a panel. I know if you've been reading some of the great messages that adults with DCC have been sharing in the chat. We're actually going to have a panel that Jasmin will moderate with all of the adults with DCC, so we can dig into their experiences a little bit more. So you won't want to miss that either. In terms of calls for the rest of this month, on November 25th, there will be a grandparents call at 11:30 a.m. ET. All of the calls are ET. There's also going to be a teen talk call, which is a pretty new call for us. But if you have a teen with DCC, please encourage them to join. They're joining on their own unless they need someone to speak for them. But that should be, I think, a lot of fun for the teens. And on November 26th, there's going to be another Dad's Forum call where we will unpack a lot of what was discussed for the first chat about language and also managing big emotions. I know you all have tons of experience and expertise, so we want to hear directly from you. And similarly for the moms call that will be on November 28th at 8 p.m., covering the topics that were discussed during the webinar as well. So with that, oh, and sorry, there's also in December, there'll be a mom's call, a dad's call, and then also a kids call. I don't have the date in front. I think it's December 9th. Kathy, can you confirm that? I think it's December 9th at 3 p.m. Yep, December 9th at 3 p.m. So ages 7 to 11. Please have your kids come out. It'll be a fun holiday time for both of the teens and the kids calls where they get to know each other, share their experiences, and do some fun crafts. And Kathy is so fun. So your kids are gonna love it. But thank you all so much for joining. We'll have all of these calls posted on YouTube. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to info@nodcc.org, or you can reach me at community@nodcc.org. And we look forward to reconnecting with you at the upcoming webinars and through the monthly calls that we have throughout the year. So have a great holiday season and a happy new year. We look forward to talking to you again. Thanks so much, Jasmin. Bye-bye.